The inheritance reading stopped the moment Harlan Briggs stepped through the door. Clara Tanner's pen froze above the ledger. Every eye in the cramped bank office turned toward the stranger, framed in afternoon light, dust motes swirling around his worn boots and dark jacket. He removed his hat slowly, revealing rough-cut black hair and tired eyes that swept the room once before landing on her. The lawyer, clearing his throat, broke the silence. The deed to Willow Ranch sat on the desk between them, unsigned, contested, and worth more than Clara had ever imagined. Her late uncle's will had named her sole heir. But the ranch came with a dangerous condition: finish the autumn cattle drive, or lose everything to creditors by winter. She had 3 weeks. She had no experience. She had a wedding planned for next month to a banker's son, who would never let her risk his reputation on a cattle drive. And now, this surveyor stood in her doorway, holding a leather case that looked like it contained the kind of trouble she could not afford. Harlan Briggs introduced himself with the clipped efficiency of a man who had learned not to waste words. He had been hired by the Territorial Land Office to survey disputed property lines along the basin. Willow Ranch sat squarely in the middle of 3 overlapping claims, 2 of them backed by men who did not lose gracefully. He needed access to the ranch records. He needed it today. Clara felt the lawyer's warning glance, but ignored it. She stood, smoothing her apron with hands that wanted to shake. "You will have to wait until the estate is settled," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Harlan's expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes. "The drive deadline is in 3 weeks," he said quietly. "If you do not know where your property ends and theirs begins, you will lose cattle, lose the drive, and lose the ranch before you ever sign that deed." The truth of it hit like a fist. Clara had spent 2 years behind this desk, processing loans and filing paperwork, building a reputation for precision and discretion. She knew numbers. She knew regulations. She did not know cattle, did not know the basin's tangled web of old claims and older grudges, and she sure as hell did not know how to survive 3 weeks in the open with a herd and a crew who would see her as a liability. But she knew when a man was telling her the only truth that mattered. She picked up the deed, folded it carefully, and tucked it into her apron pocket. The lawyer started to protest. Clara cut him off with a look she had learned from her uncle, the one that said the decision was made, and arguing would only waste time they did not have. She told Harlan Briggs to meet her at the ranch at dawn. Then, she walked out of the bank and into the kind of choice that could not be undone. Her fiancé found her an hour later, packing supplies in the back room of the general store. Daniel Whitmore was everything Juniper Basin considered respectable. Banker's son, church, deacon, polished boots, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He had proposed 6 months ago with a ring that cost more than Clara made in a year, and she had said yes because it seemed like the safe choice, the smart choice, the choice that would finally erase the shame of her father's bankruptcy 5 years earlier. Now he stood in the doorway, watching her load flour and coffee into a canvas bag, and his smile was gone. "You are not seriously considering this," he said. Clara did not look up. "The drive is part of the inheritance. If I do not finish it, the ranch goes to auction. Then let it go to auction. Sell your claim now and walk away with something. We can start fresh after the wedding." She finally met his eyes. Her uncle spent 30 years building that ranch. "I am not selling it to men who want to carve it up for profit." Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice to the tone he used when he wanted to sound reasonable. "You are a bank clerk, Clara. You do not know the first thing about cattle or trail driving. You will embarrass yourself, embarrass me, and lose everything anyway. Be sensible." The word sensible landed like a slap. Clara had been sensible her entire life. Sensible when her father drank away their savings. Sensible when she took the clerk job at 16 to keep food on the table. Sensible when she accepted Daniel's courtship, because he represented stability, security, a future without fear. But somewhere between the bank and this back room, sensible had stopped feeling like safety and started feeling like surrender. She pulled the ring from her finger and set it on the table between them. The metal made a small, final sound against the wood. Daniel stared at the ring, then at her, his face flushing. "You are choosing a cattle drive over our future? I am choosing to find out what I am capable of," Clara said. "If that is not a future you want, then we did not have one to begin with." He left without another word, taking the ring and every illusion of safety with him. Clara finished packing as the sun dropped toward the hills. Her hands were steady now. She did not feel brave. She felt terrified and awake in a way she had not been in years, and when she walked out of the store into the cooling evening, the whole town seemed to be watching. The scandal spread faster than wildfire. By nightfall, everyone in Juniper Basin knew Clara Tanner had broken her engagement and planned to run a cattle drive with a stranger. Respectable women crossed the street to avoid her. Her landlady left a pointed note about finding new lodging after the month. The minister's wife made sure Clara overheard her thoughts on women who confused independence with recklessness. Clara lay awake that night in her rented room, staring at the ceiling and wondering if Daniel had been right. Maybe she was being reckless. Maybe she would lose everything. Maybe she was a fool for trusting a surveyor she had met once and a ranch she had only visited twice as a child. But when dawn broke cold and clear, she was already dressed, bag packed, walking the dusty road toward Willow Ranch with her uncle's deed in her pocket, and a knot of fear and determination tangled so tight in her chest she could not tell them apart. Harlan Briggs was waiting when she arrived, standing beside a gray horse near the ranch house porch. The building looked smaller and more weathered than she remembered. Paint peeling, shutters crooked. The whole place wearing the exhaustion of a man who had worked himself to death, trying to hold it together. Harlan's gaze swept over her once, taking in the travel bag, the sturdy boots, the braid pinned tight, and the set of her jaw. He did not ask about the broken engagement. He did not offer sympathy or doubt. He just nodded toward the barn and said, "The crew is already in the north pasture. We will start with the property lines, then meet them at midday." Clara followed him into the ranch office, a cramped room that smelled of leather and old paper. Maps covered the walls, some of them decades old, boundary lines drawn and redrawn in fading ink. Harlan spread a newer survey across the desk, weighted the corners with stones, and pointed to 3 overlapping sections. "Your uncle's original claim is solid here," he said, tracing the eastern boundary. "But 20 years ago, a man named Voss filed a counterclaim based on an old Spanish land grant. It was never properly contested. Then 5 years ago, a cattle syndicate bought up debt all along the basin and started pushing boundaries south. If we do not have clear lines before the drive, Voss or the syndicate will take any cattle that cross into disputed territory. You lose the herd. You lose the contract. You lose the contract. You lose the ranch." Clara studied the map, forcing herself to see it clearly despite the rising panic. Who holds the debt? Harlan hesitated, just a fraction of a second. But it was enough. "A man named Kane," he said finally. He runs most of the gambling and lending west of the basin. He bought your uncle's note 2 months before he died. The name hit Clara like cold water. She knew Kane by reputation only. The kind of man who collected debts the way other men collected cattle, and did not care much how he got paid, as long as he got paid in full. If he held paper on Willow Ranch, he had leverage, and men like Kane did not let leverage go to waste. "How much does the ranch owe him?" she asked. Harlan met her eyes. "Enough that if you do not finish this drive, Kane gets the ranch outright." The room felt suddenly smaller. Clara straightened, pulling air into her lungs, pushing down the fear that wanted to drag her under. She had walked away from a safe marriage. She had burned her reputation. She was standing in a dying ranch office with a stranger who knew more about her future than she did. And the only way forward was through 3 weeks of hard country, dangerous men, and a debt she could not pay any other way. "All right," she said. "Show me the boundaries." They spent the morning riding the eastern line, Harlan marking disputed sections with stakes and explaining the logic of each old claim. Clara listened, asked questions, and tried to memorize a landscape that seemed to shift every time she thought she understood it. The basin stretched wide and deceptive, rolling grassland, broken by ravines, rock formations, and dry creek beds that could turn into flash floods with one hard rain. It was beautiful and brutal, and it did not care whether she succeeded or failed. By midday, they reached the north pasture, where her uncle's crew waited with the herd. 4 men, all of them older than Clara, all of them watching her with a kind of skepticism that did not need words. The trail boss, a lean man named Corbett with a gray beard and sharp eyes, dismounted and walked over slowly. "Miss Tanner," he said, voice flat. "Your uncle was a good man. But driving cattle is not bookkeeping. If you are planning to ride with us, you need to know what you are walking into." Clara dismounted, legs aching from hours in the saddle, and met his gaze without flinching. "I know I do not have your experience. I know I am going to make mistakes. But this ranch is mine now, and I am not asking permission to finish what my uncle started. I am asking you to teach me enough to get through it." Corbett studied her for a long moment, then glanced at Harlan. The surveyor stood a few paces back, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Finally, Corbett nodded once. "We leave at first light tomorrow. You will ride drag. If you fall behind, we are not stopping the herd to wait." Clara nodded. Understood. The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation. Clara helped pack supplies, check tack, and tried to absorb a lifetime of trail knowledge compressed into terse instructions shouted over the noise of restless cattle. Her hands blistered. Her back ached. By the time the sun set, she was filthy, exhausted, and more uncertain than ever. But when Harlan found her sitting on the porch steps after supper, staring at the dark hills, he did not offer comfort or doubt. He just sat down beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cooling night, and said quietly, "You did well today." Clara let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "I do not know what I am doing. Neither did your uncle when he started." Harlan's voice was low, matter of fact. He just kept going until he figured it out. She turned to look at him, studying the tired lines around his eyes, the stubble shadowing his jaw, the way he held himself like a man who had learned to carry weight without complaint. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "The land office pays you to survey, not to nursemaid a cattle drive." Harlan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I owe your uncle a debt. He gave me work when no one else would. I plan to see his ranch survive, even if he is not here to see it." There was more to it, Clara sensed, something in the careful way he said it. But she did not push. Instead, she asked, "What happened? Why would no one hire you?" Harlan looked out at the dark basin. "I made a mistake on a survey 5 years ago. A man lost his land because of it. He lost everything. I have been paying for it ever since." The honesty of it startled her. Clara had spent years hiding her father's bankruptcy, burying the shame under perfect ledgers and respectable choices. But Harlan wore his mistake like a scar, visible and undefended. And somehow, that made him more solid, more real than anyone she had let close in a long time. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Every day," he said. "But regret does not change it. The only thing I can do is make sure I do not make the same mistake twice." Clara felt something shift inside her. A small crack in the wall she had built between who she had been and who she was trying to become. She wanted to tell him about the bankruptcy, about the years of shame, about the debt her father had left like a stain she could not scrub out. But the word stuck, and instead she just nodded and said, "Then I guess we both have something to prove." Harlan looked at her then, really looked at her, and the weight of it made her pulse quicken. "You already proved it today," he said. "The rest is just showing up." They left at dawn the next morning, the herd moving slow and restless under a pale sky. Clara rode drag like Corbett ordered, eating dust and choking on the noise, her horse dancing sideways every time a steer bolted. Harlan rode point with Corbett, setting the pace, and Clara told herself it was better this way. Better to prove herself, without his eyes on her every mistake. But the day stretched long and brutal. The sun climbed high and merciless. The herd spooked twice, once at a rattlesnake, and once at nothing Clara could see. By midday, her legs were numb, her throat raw from dust, and she was starting to understand why Corbett had not expected her to last. She lasted anyway. That night, they camped in a shallow ravine with good water and sparse grass. Clara helped with the horses, forced down food she could not taste, and fell asleep before the stars came out. She woke once in the dark to the sound of restless cattle, and Harlan's low voice calming them. And she drifted back to sleep, thinking about the quiet competence in his hands, the way he moved like a man who knew how to be still and when to act. The second day was worse. A steer broke away, and Clara went after it without thinking, chasing it down a rocky slope that turned loose under her horse's hooves. She got the steer back, but when she returned to the herd, Corbett was waiting with a look that said she had been lucky, and luck ran out fast in open country. Harlan found her at the remuda that evening, checking her horse's hooves for stones. "You all right?" Clara did not look up. "I am fine. You took a risk going after that steer alone. I got it back. Did I not?" Harlan crouched beside her, close enough that she could feel his presence like heat. "You did," he said quietly. "But if you had gone down on that slope, no one would have reached you in time. You cannot prove anything if you are dead." Clara's hand stilled. She finally looked at him, saw the worry he was trying to hide, and felt something crack open inside her. "I do not know how to do this," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she wanted. "I do not know how to be what they need me to be." Harlan's gaze held hers. You do not have to be what they need. You just have to be steady. The rest will come. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that showing up was enough, that she did not have to be perfect or fearless or anything, except stubborn enough to keep going. But the fear was still there, tight and cold in her chest, whispering that she was going to fail, going to lose everything, going to prove Daniel right. Harlan must have seen it on her face, because he reached out, slow and careful, and covered her hand with his. The touch was warm, solid, grounding. You are stronger than you think, he said. I have seen men with years of experience fold under less pressure. You are still here. That counts. Clara felt the sting of unexpected tears and blinked them back hard. She turned her hand over, lacing her fingers with his for just a moment, letting herself take the comfort he offered. Then she pulled away, stood, and forced her voice steady. Thank you. Harlan rose beside her, and for a heartbeat they just stood there in the fading light, close enough to feel the pull between them. The thing that had been building since the moment he walked into the bank. Then he stepped back, nodded once, and walked away, leaving Clara standing by the horses, with her heart pounding and her resolve shakier than she wanted to admit. The third day brought the first real trouble. They were pushing the herd through a narrow pass when riders appeared on the ridge above them, 3 men on horseback, silhouetted against the late morning sun. Corbett called a halt, and the crew went still, hands drifting toward rifles. Harlan rode up beside Corbett, his face tight. That is Voss's crew. Clara urged her horse forward, ignoring Corbett's warning glance. What do they want? Harlan's jaw tightened. They want to make sure we know we are crossing disputed ground. If any cattle stray into Voss's territory, he will claim them. One of the riders started down the slope, slow and deliberate. He was a big man, with a thick beard and a rifle across his saddle. And when he reached the herd, he looked straight at Clara, with the kind of smirk that made her skin crawl. Heard old Tanner's niece is running this drive now, he said. That is a lot of responsibility for a lady bank clerk. Clara held his gaze, refusing to let him see her fear. The ranch is mine. The drive is legal. If you have a problem with that, take it up with the land office. The man grinned. Oh, I do not have a problem, miss. I am just here to remind you that boundaries matter. Lose a steer on the wrong side of the line, and it does not come back. Lose enough, and you do not finish the drive. Be a shame if that happened. Harlan moved his horse between Clara and the rider, his voice low and cold. The lines are marked. We are not crossing into Voss's claim. You can ride back and tell him we are staying clean. The man's grin faded. He looked at Harlan for a long moment, then spat into the dirt and turned his horse. The other 2 riders followed him back up the ridge, and the crew let out a collective breath. Corbett looked at Clara. That was a warning. Voss is not going to let this drive finish without a fight. Clara's hands were shaking, but she kept them steady on the reins. Then, we will have to make sure he does not have a reason to fight. They pushed on, but the encounter left everyone on edge. That night, Corbett doubled the watch, and Clara lay awake, listening to the sounds of the herd. The creak of saddles, the low murmur of the crew talking in shifts. She knew Voss was just the first problem. There was still the syndicate, still Kane's debt, still the reality that one mistake could unravel everything. And there was Harlan, who had stepped between her and danger without hesitation, who watched her like she mattered, who made her feel both safer and more exposed than she had ever been. The fourth day brought rain, cold and relentless, turning the trail into mud and the herd into a churning mess of panicked cattle. Clara rode through it blind, her shawl soaked through, her hands numb on the reins, shouting orders she could barely hear over the thunder and the noise. A steer went down in the mud, and she dismounted to help pull it free, sinking knee-deep in muck, her boots lost in the sucking ground. Harlan appeared beside her, grabbing the steer's halter, hauling with her until the animal lurched upright and bolted. He pulled Clara out of the mud, his grip strong and sure, and for a moment they stood there in the pouring rain, breathing hard, soaked to the bone, and something shifted between them. Something raw and undeniable. "You did not have to do that," Clara gasped. Harlan looked at her, rain streaming down his face. "Yes, I did." They made camp that night in a miserable hollow with no shelter, and a fire that refused to stay lit. Clara changed into dry clothes behind a canvas tarp and tried to stop shivering. When she emerged, Harlan handed her a tin cup of coffee that tasted like mud and smoke and was the best thing she had ever swallowed. She sat beside him by the struggling fire, close enough that their shoulders touched, and neither of them moved away. "How much farther?" she asked. "4 more days if the weather holds. 6, if it does not." Clara closed her eyes, exhaustion settling over her like a weight. "I do not know if I can do this for 6 more days." Harlan was quiet for a moment. "Then," he said, "when I made that survey mistake 5 years ago, I thought my life was over. Thought I would spend the rest of my days running from it. Your uncle was the first person who gave me a chance to prove I was more than one mistake. He told me the only way forward was to keep moving, even when it felt impossible. Especially then." Clara opened her eyes and looked at him. "What did you say?" "I said I did not deserve a second chance." He said deserving had nothing to do with it. You just had to decide whether you were going to let the mistake define you, or whether you were going to define what came next. The words hit Clara like a fist to the chest. She had spent 5 years trying to outrun her father's bankruptcy, trying to prove she was respectable, responsible, worthy of a future that did not include shame. But maybe deserving was not the point. Maybe the point was deciding who she wanted to be and then becoming that person, one brutal day at a time. She leaned her head against Harlan's shoulder, just for a moment, letting herself take the comfort of his steadiness. He did not pull away. He just sat there, solid and warm. And for the first time in days, Clara felt like she might actually survive this. The 5th day brought trouble of a different kind. They were crossing through syndicate territory under the terms of an old right-of-way when a rider came hard from the east, dust rising behind him. Corbett called a halt, and the crew went tense. The rider pulled up in front of them, a young man with a syndicate brand on his horse, and a message that landed like a hammer. "Kane wants to see Miss Tanner. Tonight. Alone." Clara's blood went cold. "Where?" "The old line shack at Black Creek. Sundown. He said if you do not come, he will call the debt due tomorrow." Harlan's voice cut through the silence, low and dangerous. "She is not going alone." The rider shrugged. "Kane said alone, or the deal is off." He turned his horse and rode away before anyone could argue. Corbett looked at Clara, his face grim. "This is a trap. Kane does not negotiate. He is going to force you into something you cannot walk away from." Clara's mind raced. If she did not go, Kane would call the debt and take the ranch before the drive even finished. If she went, She was walking into the kind of situation women did not walk out of unchanged. But the only other option was to give up. And she had not come this far to give up now. "I am going," she said. Harlan stepped forward, his expression hard. "Then, I am going with you." Clara met his eyes and saw the fear there, the barely controlled anger, the same protective instinct that had made him step between her and Voss's man. She wanted to let him come. She wanted the safety of his presence, the reassurance that she would not face Kane alone. But Kane had been clear, and if she broke the terms, he would use it as an excuse to take everything. "You cannot," she said quietly. "If I bring you, he will call it a breach and take the ranch tonight." Harlan's jaw tightened. "I am not letting you walk into that alone." Clara reached out, touched his arm, felt the tension coiled there. "I know," she said, "but I do not have a choice." They made camp early, and Clara spent the afternoon preparing. She changed into her cleanest blouse, pinned her braid tight, and checked the small derringers she had carried since leaving town. It was not much, but it was something, and she was not walking into Black Creek completely defenseless. Harlan found her as the sun started to drop. "I do not like this." "I do not like it either," Clara said. "But it is the only move I have." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the worry etched into every line of his face. "If Kane tries anything, you shoot first and run. Do not negotiate. Do not try to reason with him. Just get out." Clara nodded, throat tight. "I will." Harlan reached out, hesitated, then cupped her face with one hand, his touch warm and rough and grounding. "Promise me you will come back." The words hung between them, weighted with everything they had not said, everything that had been building since the day he walked into the bank. Clara covered his hand with hers, held his gaze, and said, "I promise." Then she mounted her horse and rode toward Black Creek, leaving Harlan standing in the camp with fear in his eyes and no way to follow. The line shack sat in a hollow surrounded by scrub brush and rocks, a sagging structure that looked abandoned except for the lamplight glowing in the single window. Clara dismounted 100 yards out, tied her horse to a dead tree, and walked the rest of the way on foot, her hand on the derringer in her pocket. Kane was waiting inside, sitting at a rough table with a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. He was a lean man with silver hair and cold eyes, dressed in a dark suit that looked out of place in the wilderness. He smiled when Clara stepped through the door, and the smile did not reach his eyes. "Miss Tanner," he said, "glad you could make it. Sit down." Clara stayed standing. "You said you wanted to talk about the debt." Kane poured whiskey into both glasses, pushed one toward her. "I did. Your uncle owed me $8,000. The ranch is worth maybe 10 if you finish the drive and sell at market. That is a thin margin, especially with Voss and the syndicate both looking to take a piece. So, I have a proposal." Clara's stomach tightened. "I am listening." Kane leaned back, studying her like a man appraising livestock. "You marry me. The debt gets folded into the marriage contract. The ranch stays in your name, but I get a share of the profits and a say in how it is run. You get to keep your inheritance. I get a respectable wife and a stake in good land. Everybody wins." The room tilted. Clara forced herself to breathe, to think past the shock and disgust. This was not a proposal. It was a trap. A cage dressed up as an offer, and Kane knew it. "And if I refuse?" she asked. Kane's smile sharpened. Then I call the debt tomorrow. The ranch goes to auction. You lose everything. I buy it for pennies on the dollar and you walk away with nothing but a reputation for poor judgment. Your choice, Miss Tanner. Clara's mind raced. She could refuse, could walk out and lose the ranch, lose the drive, lose everything she had fought for. Or she could agree, could trade one kind of cage for another, spend the rest of her life tied to a man who saw her as property. Or she could find another way. I need time to think about it, she said. Kane's eyes narrowed. You have until tomorrow night. After that, the offer expires and I move on the debt. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the door. Then he paused, looked back at her with something cold and calculating. One more thing. That surveyor you have been spending time with, Harlan Briggs. He is not what he seems. You might want to ask him about the Cartwright Ranch before you trust him too far. Then he walked out, leaving Clara standing in the lamplight with her heart pounding and her mind spinning with questions she did not want to ask. She rode back to camp in full dark, pushing the horse hard, needing the cold air and the motion to clear her head. When she arrived, Harlan was waiting at the edge of the firelight, pacing like a caged animal. He saw her and crossed the distance in 3 strides, his hands gripping her arms, his eyes searching her face. What happened? Are you hurt? Clara shook her head, suddenly exhausted beyond words. He wants me to marry him. If I do not, he calls the debt tomorrow and takes the ranch. Harlan's face went white, then hard as stone. You are not marrying him. I do not see another option, Clara said, and her voice broke on the words. If I refuse, I lose everything. If I agree, I lose myself. Either way, Kane wins. Harlan let go of her arms and turned away, fists clenched, fighting for control. Then, he turned back, and when he spoke, his voice was low and raw. There is something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you days ago. Clara's chest tightened. Kane said I should ask you about the Cartwright Ranch. Harlan closed his eyes, and when he opened them, the guilt there was so naked it hurt to look at. The survey mistake I made 5 years ago, he said quietly. It was the Cartwright Ranch. I miscalculated a boundary line. Cartwright lost 200 acres to a neighboring claim. He could not recover. He lost the ranch, lost his savings, lost everything. 6 months later, he put a bullet in his head. The words landed like blows. Clara felt the ground shift under her, felt the fragile trust between them crack wide open. Why did you not tell me? Because I was afraid you would not let me help, Harlan said, and his voice was hoarse. I was afraid you would see me the way everyone else does, as the surveyor who killed a man with a mistake. But I need you to know that I have checked these boundary lines 3 times. I have staked every disputed section. I have made sure that what happened to Cartwright will not happen to you. I swear to you, Clara, I will not let you lose this ranch. Clara stared at him, trying to reconcile the man who had ridden beside her for 5 days, who had pulled her out of the mud, who had promised she was stronger than she thought, with the man who had cost another person everything. The anger and fear and betrayal tangled so tight she could not breathe. But under it all, she heard the truth in his voice, the desperation, the guilt he had been carrying like a weight he could not put down. And she understood, because she had been carrying her own weight for just as long. Did my uncle know? She asked. Yes. He knew everything. He hired me anyway. He said I deserved a chance to do it right. Clara looked away, blinking back tears. She wanted to be angry. She wanted to push him away, to protect herself from the risk of trusting someone who had already failed once. But she was so tired of protecting herself, so tired of building walls, and the truth was that Harlan had been there every step of the way, steadying her when she faltered, believing in her when she did not believe in herself. I need you to promise me something, she said finally. Anything. Promise me you will not let me make this choice alone. Promise me we will find another way. Harlan stepped closer, and this time when he touched her face it felt like a vow. I promise, he said. We will find another way. Together. They sat by the fire that night, side by side, and planned. Corbett joined them, grim-faced but sharp. And between the three of them they pieced together a strategy. Kane's leverage was the debt, but the debt was tied to the ranch, and the ranch was only worth something if the drive succeeded. If they could finish the drive ahead of schedule, if they could deliver the herd and get paid before Kane moved, they might be able to pay off enough of the debt to force a renegotiation. It was a thin chance, but it was the only chance they had. They pushed hard the next day, driving the herd faster than was safe, taking risks that made Corbett swear and the crew grumble. But Clara rode point with Harlan, and together they kept the herd moving, kept the pace relentless, kept the momentum building toward the railhead at Silver Bend. By midday they were ahead of schedule. By sunset they were in sight of the final valley. And that was when the syndicate made its move. Riders appeared on both flanks, a dozen men armed and ready, blocking the pass that led to Silver Bend. At the center rode a man Clara recognized from town, a syndicate lawyer named Garrett, who had a reputation for turning legal disputes into bloodshed. Garrett rode forward, stopped 20 yards out, and called across the distance. Miss Tanner, I am here on behalf of the Basin Cattle Syndicate. We have filed a counterclaim on this herd based on disputed grazing rights. Until the claim is resolved, the herd stays here. Clara felt the world narrow to a single point of cold clarity. This was it. This was the move Kane had orchestrated, using the syndicate to stop the drive, to run out the clock, to force her into his trap. She looked at Harlan, saw the same realization on his face, and then she looked at Corbett. The trail boss met her eyes and gave a single, sharp nod. Clara turned back to Garrett and raised her voice so every man in both crews could hear. The grazing rights are documented. The boundaries are staked and certified by the Territorial Land Office. This herd is legal, and this drive is legal. If you want to dispute it, take it up with the judge in Silver Bend. But you are not stopping us here. Garrett's smile was thin and ugly. We will see about that. He gave a signal, and the riders started forward. Corbett shouted an order and the crew drew rifles. Clara's pulse hammered, but she kept her hands steady on the reins, kept her eyes on Garrett, and waited for the first shot that would turn this into the kind of fight no one walked away from. And then Harlan spurred his horse forward, riding straight toward the syndicate line, with his hands raised and empty. Garrett, he called. You know me. You know my work. If you want proof these boundaries are clean, I will ride to Silver Bend with you right now and show you every survey mark, every stake, every certified document. But if you start a fight here, you are going to lose men, lose time, and lose the legal high ground. Is that really what the syndicate wants? Garrett hesitated. The riders behind him shifted, uncertain. And in that moment of hesitation, Clara saw the opening. She urged her horse forward, stopping beside Harlan, and looked Garrett in the eye. "Or you can let us through," she said. "We deliver the herd, we get paid, and your syndicate files a formal dispute through the land office like civilized people. No blood, no legal mess, just business." The silence stretched thin and dangerous. Then, Garrett turned his horse, called to his men, and the syndicate riders pulled back, opening the pass. Clara did not breathe until they were through, the herd moving again, the railhead visible in the distance. Then she looked at Harlan and saw the same shaky relief on his face. "We just bought ourselves one day," he said quietly. "Maybe two, if we are lucky. Kane is going to move fast once he realizes we got through. Then we move faster," Clara said. They reached Silver Bend at dawn the next morning, driving the herd straight to the railhead stockyards in the gray light before the town fully woke. The buyer was waiting, a no-nonsense cattleman named Hollis, who looked over the herd with a critical eye and a tally book. Clara stood beside him, exhausted and filthy and so tense she thought she might shatter, while he counted, checked brands, and made notes. Finally, Hollis looked up. "You have got a clean herd, and you are 3 days early. That is worth a bonus." He named a figure that made Clara's knees go weak. It was enough. It was just barely enough to pay off Kane's debt and have a little left over. Clara signed the contract with shaking hands, took the bank draft, and turned to find Harlan standing a few feet away, watching her with something fierce and proud and tender in his eyes. "We did it," she said, and her voice broke on the words. "No," Harlan said quietly. "You did it. I just kept up." They walked to the bank together, Clara clutching the draft like a lifeline, Harlan a solid presence at her side. The banker processed the payment with a kind of efficiency that came from handling large sums. And when he handed Clara the receipt showing the debt paid in full, she felt something inside her finally let go. She walked out into the morning sunlight, free for the first time in 5 years, and broke down crying right there on the boardwalk. Harlan caught her, held her, let her shake apart against his chest while the town moved around them. He did not say anything. He just held her, steady and warm and real, until the storm passed and Clara could breathe again. She pulled back, wiping her eyes, and looked up at him. "I do not know what happens now." Harlan's hand came up, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "What do you want to happen?" Clara thought about the ranch, about the wide basin and the weathered house, and the hard work of building something that mattered. She thought about Harlan's steady hands, his quiet competence, the way he saw her not as a bank clerk or a scandal or a debt to be managed, but as someone strong enough to hold her own ground. "I want to go home," she said. "I want to rebuild the ranch. I want to prove my uncle was right to trust me with it. And I want you there, if you want to be." Harlan's eyes darkened with something that looked like hope and fear tangled together. "I am not an easy man to build a life with," he said quietly. "I have made mistakes. I have enemies. People in this basin will not forget what happened to Cartwright." "I do not care what people think," Clara said, and meant it. "I care that you showed up every day. I care that you kept your promises. I care that when it mattered, you chose to help me instead of protecting yourself. That is enough." Harlan looked at her for a long moment, And then he smiled, slow and real and transforming. "All right then," he said. "Let us go home." But the story was not over yet. They were halfway back to the ranch, riding through the basin in the late morning sun, when a rider appeared on the ridge ahead. Clara's stomach dropped when she recognized Cain. Alone this time. No threats. No leverage. Just a man who had lost a game he thought he had rigged. He rode down slowly, stopped a dozen yards out, and looked at Clara with something like respect. "I underestimated you, Miss Tanner," he said. "That does not happen often." Clara met his gaze without flinching. "The debt is paid. You have no claim on my ranch." Cain nodded. "True. But I wanted you to know something. Your uncle and I had an understanding. He knew I was a dangerous man to owe money to, but he also knew I kept my word. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would give you a chance to prove yourself. I kept that promise. The debt was real, but the deadline was mine to control. I could have called it any time. I waited to see what you would do." Clara felt the world tilt sideways. "You mean this was all a test?" Cain's smile was thin and humorless. "Call it what you want. Your uncle believed you were stronger than you knew. I gave you the chance to prove him right. You did. That is worth something." He tipped his hat, turned his horse, and rode away without another word, leaving Clara and Harlan staring after him. Harlan finally broke the silence. "I do not know whether to respect that or hate him for it." Clara let out a shaky laugh. "Both. Definitely both." They reached Willow Ranch as the sun began its long descent toward the hills. The place looked the same, weathered and tired. But now, it looked like possibility instead of burden. Clara dismounted, walked up the porch steps, and turned to look at the basin stretching wide and golden under the afternoon light. Harlan came to stand beside her. "What are you thinking?" Clara smiled. "I am thinking this is going to be a lot of work. Good thing you are not afraid of work. Good thing I am not doing it alone." Harlan looked at her, and the tenderness in his eyes made her chest ache. "You're sure about this? About me?" Clara reached out, took his hand, laced their fingers together. "I have never been more sure of anything." They stood there on the porch, watching the light change across the land they would build together. And for the first time, in longer than Clara could remember, the future felt like something worth reaching for. The weeks that followed were a blur of hard work and slow rebuilding. Clara and Harlan hired a new crew, repaired fences, restocked supplies, and started planning for the spring drive. The town gossip eventually faded, replaced by grudging respect when word spread that Clara Tanner had paid off Cain, finished the drive, and kept her ranch. Daniel Whitmore married a banker's daughter from the next county and never spoke Clara's name again. Voss tried one more boundary dispute and lost when Harlan's surveys held up in territorial court. The syndicate moved on to easier targets, and Clara learned what it meant to build a life on her own terms. To wake up every morning with sore muscles and dirty hands and a sense of purpose that felt like freedom. Harlan stayed. He worked the ranch, ran surveys for neighboring spreads, and slowly rebuilt his reputation, one careful, honest job at a time. He and Clara fell into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing, working side by side through long days and falling into bed exhausted and content when the sun went down. They did not talk about marriage right away. There was too much work, too much healing, Too much they were both still learning about trust and partnership. But one evening in late autumn, sitting on the porch watching the first stars come out, Harlan turned to Clara and said quietly, "I want to ask you something." Clara looked at him, saw the nervousness under the calm, and felt her pulse quicken. "All right. I know you already turned down one proposal this year. And I know marriage is not something you take lightly. But I need you to know that I am not asking because it is practical, or convenient, or because it makes sense on paper. I am asking because I love you. I love your strength, your stubbornness, the way you face down danger without flinching. I love waking up beside you and working beside you, and falling asleep knowing you are close. I want to build this life with you, not just as a partner, but as your husband. If you will have me." Clara felt tears sting her eyes, but this time they were the good kind. The kind that came from something breaking open in the best possible way. She took his face in her hands, kissed him slow and sure, and when she pulled back she was smiling. "Yes," she said. 1,000 times yes. They married in the spring, a small ceremony on the ranch with Corbett and the crew as witnesses, and a traveling preacher who did not ask questions about scandal or broken engagements. Clara wore a simple dress she had sewn herself, and Harlan wore his cleanest shirt and looked at her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. And when they stood together on the porch that evening, watching the sun set over the basin they had fought so hard to keep, Clara thought about her uncle, about the debt and the danger, and the impossible choice that had brought her here. She thought about the girl she had been, hiding behind ledgers and safe choices, terrified of failing. She was not that girl anymore. She was Clara Briggs now, rancher, partner, wife. A woman who had learned that deserving peace was not about being perfect or respectable or safe. It was about showing up, doing the work, and choosing the people who saw you clearly and loved you anyway. Harlan wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "What are you thinking?" Clara leaned into him, smiling. "I am thinking, we did it. We actually did it." "We did," Harlan agreed. "And we are going to keep doing it. Every day. Together." Clara looked out at the basin, at the ranch that was theirs now, at the future stretching wide and uncertain and full of possibility. The wind carried the scent of grass and dust and distant rain, and somewhere in the hills a coyote called. And Clara felt something settle deep inside her, something that felt like home. The first year of marriage was not easy. There were hard frosts that killed half the spring calves, a summer drought that dried up the creek, and a bad stretch in autumn when Harlan came down with fever, and Clara spent 3 sleepless nights nursing him through it, terrified she would lose him just when she had found him. But they made it through. They learned each other's rhythms, learned how to fight fair and make up honest, learned that love was not the easy, breathless thing from storybooks, but something you built one day at a time, through shared work and shared risk, and the choice to keep choosing each other, even when it was hard. By the second spring, the ranch was thriving. Clara had expanded the herd, hired 2 more hands, and started breeding horses on the side. Harlan had become the most trusted surveyor in the basin, his reputation rebuilt through steady, careful work. Together, they had paid off the last of the ranch expenses and started putting money aside for the future. And one morning in early summer, Clara woke up sick and knew with absolute certainty what it meant. She told Harlan that evening, sitting on the porch in the golden light, watching the basin settle into twilight. He stared at her for a long moment, then pulled her into his arms so tight she could barely breathe. And when he finally let go, his eyes were wet, and his smile was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "A baby," he said, voice rough with wonder. "We are going to have a baby." Clara laughed, tears streaming down her face. "We are going to have a baby." They sat there together as the stars came out, talking about the future in hushed, hopeful voices. And Clara thought about how far she had come from the frightened girl who had stood in the bank office 2 years ago, holding a deed and a decision that felt impossible. She had chosen the hard road. She had chosen danger and risk, and the terrifying possibility of failure. And she had found something she never expected. A life that felt like hers. A love that felt like home. And a future that stretched wide and bright with promise. The baby came in late winter, a daughter with dark hair, and her father's steady eyes, and her mother's stubborn chin. They named her Rose, after Clara's mother, and she was healthy and loud and perfect. Clara learned how to balance ranching and motherhood, learned how to carry Rose in a sling while checking fences, learned how to nurse while going over the books. Harlan learned how to change diapers, soothe a crying infant at 3 in the morning, and look at his daughter with a fierce protective love that made Clara's heart ache in the best way. And on Rose's first birthday, they stood together in the ranch yard, surrounded by crew and neighbors who had become friends, and Clara looked around at the life they had built and felt something close to perfect contentment. Corbett raised a glass, grinning. "To Clara and Harlan Briggs," he said, "and to the stubbornest, bravest rancher in the basin." Everyone cheered. Clara laughed, holding Rose on her hip, and looked at Harlan. He met her eyes and smiled. And in that smile, she saw everything they had survived, everything they had built, everything they still had ahead of them. Later, when the guests had gone and Rose was asleep, Clara and Harlan stood on the porch in the cool evening air, watching the stars come out over the basin. Harlan wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Happy?" he asked quietly. Clara leaned back against him, closing her eyes, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. "More than I ever thought possible," she said. And it was true. She had walked away from safety and respectability and every easy choice, had faced down debt and danger, and the fear that she was not strong enough to survive. But she had survived. More than that, she had thrived. She had built a life on her own terms, with a man who saw her for exactly who she was and loved her for it. She had built a home, a family, a future worth fighting for. And as the stars wheeled overhead and the basin settled into quiet darkness, Clara Briggs stood on her porch, with her husband's arms around her, and her daughter sleeping inside. And she knew with absolute certainty that she had found what she had been searching for all along. Not safety, not respectability, not the absence of fear, but peace. Real, hard-won, earned through fire peace. And it was enough.